This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom, where you can pre-order every card from Phyrexia All Will Be One right now using my referral link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and today I'm continuing with my Phyrexia All Will Be One limited set review. Yesterday I took a look at all the colorless and multicolored cards in the set, and today we're continuing with a look at all the white cards. Tomorrow, I'll give you my thoughts on all the blue cards in the set, the day after that all the black cards, and so on. I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on each of these cards, and if you aren't sure what those letter grades mean, check out the description where you can find an explanation. Before we get to that first white card, a few reminders. This video is about limited. That means draft and sealed. This means I'm only reviewing cards that appear in draft boosters. Also, keep in mind that these are my feelings about these cards before actually playing the format. That means I'm definitely not going to be perfect in my predictions. After all, every format is different. As I play it and learn more about it, I'll be providing updates about the format here on the channel. Lastly, I want to let you know that I'm offering some set review related perks for both patrons and channel members. You get access to my ongoing notes during preview season, and by the end of the set review, you'll have a spreadsheet with all of my grades on it. If those perks sound interesting to you and you want to support the channel, you can find ways to become a channel member or a patron in the description. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at our first white card, which is Against All Odds, which for 3 generic and a white is an uncommon sorcery, and it says choose one or both. Exile target artifact or creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. Return target artifact or creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Individually, each of these effects is situational and not really worth the mana you're spending either, especially at sorcery speed. Blinking a creature or artifact is only going to do something in a few situations, like if you have a creature with an Enter the Battlefield ability or a creature shut down by an aura. It can give you pseudo-vigilance, I guess, but that really isn't worth 4 mana. Obviously, reanimating something small only does something when you have a target in your graveyard, and both of these things are far from guaranteed. However, you do have the option of getting both, and I think if you can do something meaningful with both parts somewhat consistently, this does seem like a fine card. That can be especially true with Enter the Battlefield abilities because you can potentially get 2 of them going at the same time. When you can only make one mode do something, though, like I've said, that isn't optimal. I think this seems alright, but there are probably only a few decks that are super interested in actually using this. So it probably needs a build-around grade. It feels like a D in your typical white deck in the format, and a C in a deck with enough Enter the Battlefield abilities. Next up, it's Annex Sentry, which for 2 generic and a white is a 1/4 artifact creature Phyrexian cleric at uncommon. It's got Toxic 1, which means when players are dealt combat damage by it, that player also gets a poison counter. When it enters the battlefield, exile target artifact or creature an opponent controls with mana value 3 or less until Annex Sentry leaves the battlefield. This is a great uncommon. It takes down a cheap artifact or creature, which it will almost always have a target for, and it leaves behind a reasonable defensive body that can even help you poison your opponent. This will often give you a big swing when you play it. I'm giving it a B. Next, it's Apostle of Invasion, which for 4 generic and 2 white is a 4/4 Phyrexian Angel at uncommon. It's got flying and it comes with Corrupted. A card with Corrupted gets a bonus when your opponent has 3 or more poison counters. In this case, the Apostle gets Double Strike. So, a 6 mana 4/4 flyer really isn't enough to cut it these days, and it's a card you end up not playing more often than you do. It's something like a D+. That much mana for something that inefficient is a real liability these days. I mean, this can die to 2 mana and 3 mana removal spells, and that feels miserable because you get nothing for your investment. You just expect more these days for 6 mana, and you do get more here. It gets Double Strike, which does make the risk of spending this much mana on it a lot better because obviously it can represent 8 damage in the air every single turn, and it does seem like a decent amount of the time, by the time this comes down, your opponent will have 3 or more poison counters, so it really comes down to how often is this actually a 6 mana 4/4 with Double Strike. And my feeling is that it will happen, but I don't think you should always count on things working out that way, and that probably makes it a C+. Next up, it's Basilica Shepherd, which for 3 generic and 2 white is a 3/3 Phyrexian Angel at common. It's got flying. When it enters the battlefield, you create 2 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature tokens with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. This seems like a pretty impressive bit of value for the cost. Sure, the tokens can't block, and that does matter. That is a big downside. One of the nice things about cards that make multiple bodies is they're good when you're behind or you're ahead. That's a little less true here, because these bodies can't actually help you stabilize. But there are enough ways to take advantage of those tokens with go-wide payoffs, and enough ways to take advantage of Toxic and enough ways to take advantage of artifacts that you're still getting pretty good value here. It's kind of funny because I think overall, this is going to be a better angel than the uncommon one we just saw. Obviously, the other one has a higher ceiling, but this has a much higher floor because it's always going to give you some value. If you play this and your opponent kills it, you don't feel that bad about it because guess what? It gave you 2 bodies. So I think this is one of White's better commons. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Bladed Ambassador, which for 1 generic into white is a 3/1 Phyrexian soldier at uncommon. It enters the battlefield with an oil counter on it, and you can pay 1 generic and remove an oil counter to give it indestructible until end of turn. Like other recent 2-mana 3/1s, it can become indestructible. This is a really good 2-drop. Sure, if you don't have Proliferate or something like that, it can only use this ability once, but the great thing about this type of ability is the thread of activation is often enough for people to decide not to block or attack into it anyway, so you don't actually have to use the ability as often as you might think. There are a lot of situations where if they do block and you can remove the counter and make it indestructible, your opponent ultimately ends up getting 2 for 1. So they're just going to take damage in a lot of situations. So even with 1 oil counter, this looks good to me. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Charge of the Mites, which for 2 generic into white is a common instant, and it says choose one. Charge of the Mites deals damage equal to the number of creatures you control to target creature or planeswalker, or create 2 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Mite artifact creature tokens with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. You're overpaying a bit for each of these modes individually, but the modality here is nice. If you're good at going wide, and if you're in white, there's a good chance you are. We've already seen lots of cards that help you do that or pay you off for doing that, right? And when that's true, it can be a reasonable removal spell where you're paying like 3 to do 4 damage to something. If you are having a hard time getting your board going, it can give you a couple of mites. There's also various things that give you effects when artifacts enter the battlefield that the mites can help you trigger. So it just feels like this has enough different things that it does and enough synergy that it's probably a C+. Next up, it's Complete Devotion, which for 1 generic into white is a common instant. It says target creature you control gets +2/+2 until end of turn. If that creature has Toxic, draw a card. So 2 mana for +2/+2 is a mediocre boost, but the 2 for 1 upside you get when you use this on a toxic creature is big. There's definitely enough toxic in white that I feel like this is a solid combat trick, one you're going to play one of in a lot of your aggressive white decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Crawling Chorus, which for 1 white mana is a 1/1 Phyrexian horror at common. It's got Toxic 1, and when it dies, it makes one of those Might tokens. 1 mana 1/1s that replace themselves with a 1/1 tend to play reasonably well, but as I've said, these Might tokens and their inability to block does make their use a little more narrow. Still, you end up with 2 toxic bodies here in the end, and I think that seems fine. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Duelist of Deep Faith, which for 1 generic into white is a 2/2 Phyrexian soldier at common with Toxic 1, and as long as it's your turn, it has First Strike. This is going to be a pain to block pretty much all game long, especially because there's nice tricks around, and that goes really well with Toxic. You know, if your opponent is looking at a card and their options are take it and get a poison counter or chump block it, they're often going to choose take it and get a poison counter. So this will help you get closer to Corrupted and potentially closer to making your opponent just lose the game because of poison. This looks like another really good common in white. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it is Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines, which for 4 generic into white is a 4/7 legendary Phyrexian Praetor at Mythic Rare. She's got Vigilance, and if a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. And permanents entering the battlefield don't cause abilities of permanents your opponents control to trigger. So a 5 mana 4/7 with Vigilance is already like a C. You'd play it most of the time. It attacks and blocks well, and Vigilance makes it so it can do both. The additional upside here is awesome though. She doubles your enter the battlefield triggers and cancels your opponents, and these days there are lots of cards that have these types of effects. We've already seen some in this video. I think she does enough to get into the lower bomb range, especially because even if your deck doesn't have a critical mass of cards with enter the battlefield triggers, there's a pretty good chance it will affect and weaken significantly one of your opponent's cards. And most of the time, you will have like 4 or 5 cards that just go crazy when Elesh Norn is in play. I'm giving her an A-. Next up, it's the Eternal Wanderer, which for 4 generic and 2 white is a 5 loyalty legendary planeswalker at rare. No more than 1 creature can attack the Eternal Wanderer each combat. Her +1 says, exile up to 1 target artifact or creature, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of that player's next instep. She has a 0 ability that creates a 2/2 white samurai creature token with double strike, and she has a -4 that says for each player, Choose a creature that player controls. Each player sacrifices all creatures they control not chosen this way. This is a massive bomb. Her static ability alone does a great job of protecting her, as taking down a walker with a single creature attacking at a time is quite the challenge. But her other abilities are also really good and make it even more challenging to ever take her down. Her +1 can be used to rebind into the battlefield ability, but you can also use it to temporarily remove opposing creatures or artifacts since they don't return until your opponent's next instep. Her 0 loyalty ability makes a pretty legit token that will do a great job of deterring them from even attacking her with that one creature. This ability can also be used when you're ahead to generate pressure, and her -4 is a little situational, but it also makes sure that if you're behind, you're going to be able to change that in a hurry, and she still holds on with 1 loyalty if you use it right away. Honestly, this feels like one of the biggest limited bombs we've ever seen. She's so powerful, builds a massive advantage, and is challenging to kill. She will alter the game in your favor every single time you play her, really no matter how far behind you are. I'm giving her an A+. Next up, it's Flensing Raptor, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/2 Phyrexian bird at common. It's got flying and toxic 1, and when it enters the battlefield, another target creature you control with toxic gets +1/+1 and gains flying until end of turn. Another nice common, you'll often have another toxic creature around, and when you do, that enter the battlefield ability can really matter. When you don't, you still get a Windrake with toxic 1, which is fine. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it is Gold Warden'S Helm, which for 2 generic and a white is a common artifact equipment. It comes with 4 Mirrodin, which means when it enters the battlefield, you create a 2/2 red rebel creature token and attach this to it. The equipped creature gets +0/+1, and you can equip it for 1 generic and a white. So, you get a 3 mana 2/3 up front here, which isn't the best baseline, but it is acceptable, especially when you have equipment and artifact payoffs in the format. The boost this offers on its own is certainly very meager, though. Like, some of these for Mirrodin cards will really feel like 2-for-1s. I don't really think this one will, because both cards you sort of get here between the token and the equipment are pretty underwhelming. Like, once the token's gone and you can just move this around for a meager boost, you're not going to feel great about it. There are equipment payoffs and artifact payoffs that make this a little better. You know, all of these for Mirrodin things are good to blink because you get a token again, but this is probably just a C-. Next up, it is Hex Gold Hover Wings, which for 3 generic and a white is an uncommon artifact equipment with for Mirrodin. Equipped creature has flying, and creatures you control that are equipped get +1/+0. So, this is a much better for Mirrodin card. It basically gives you a 4 mana 3/2 with flying up front, one that will also buff maybe a couple of other creatures who are already equipped, and a 4 mana 3/2 flyer is already like a D+ or C- level stat line. It's not great, but it would be passable, and this just has a mountain of upside along with it, between the equipment payoff in general, between the fact that it sticks around and you can move it around to give things +1/+0 in flying, a boost that is very good. Obviously, paying 3 is overpaying a little bit, but because you got that token up front and you have that additional equipment payoff, you're not going to be that upset about it. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Incisor Glider, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/3 artifact creature Phyrexian construct at common. It's got flying, and it has Corrupted. If your opponent has those 3 or more poison counters, it gives creatures you control +1/+1 until end of turn when it attacks. This is another solid common. A 2 mana 1/3 with flying is sort of passable to begin with, and this has a really nice Corrupted trigger, especially because white is going wide pretty well here. Buffing the whole board can really change combat. And it even counts itself, so keep that in mind. It doesn't hurt that cheap flyers go really well with all the equipment in the set too, so even if you're not getting Corrupted going, this would probably slot fine into like a red-white aggro deck. I'm giving this a C+. It will be interesting to see how this ultimately shakes out. I think it will be fairly doable to turn on Corrupted in white, but if it's even easier than I'm thinking, I could see this being even better. Next up, it's Indoctrination Attendant, which for 3 generic and a white is a 3/4 Phyrexian cleric at common. It's got toxic 1. When it enters the battlefield, you may return another permanent you control to its owner's hand. If you do, create a 1/1 Might token. A 4 mana 3/4 with toxic 1 is probably something like a C-, and that's sort of the baseline here. It'll be pretty easy to get a 1/1 token out of it too. Keep in mind, it doesn't say non-land permanent like a lot of these do, so at worst, like in the late game, you can just like bounce a land to your hand and then play it again or whatever and get the 1/1. At best, you can use it to rebuy, enter the battlefield abilities. You can return your Prophetic Prism and then cast it again to draw a card. Sometimes it'll be able to do really silly things. Sometimes it's just going to be a 4 mana 3/4 that makes a 1/1. But I think that's a fine baseline and it has a pretty high ceiling. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Infested Flesh Cutter, which for 1 generic into white is an uncommon artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+0. Whenever equipped creature attacks, you make a might token, and you can equip this for 2 generic and a white. I don't love the cost of casting this and equipping it, but the fact it spits out a token is what really gives it some value. It's kind of nice that after you make 1 token with this, you know you have another body to equip this to, and attacking with a 3/1 might is usually likely to be a significant attack on a lot of boards. Obviously, I think this is worse than basically all of the 4 Mirrodin equipment because those all give you a creature token up front, and this needs you to attack with something, and it's pretty clunky to equip in the first place. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Jawbone Duelist, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/1 Phyrexian soldier at uncommon. It's got double strike and toxic 1. A 2-mana 1/1 with double strike always plays pretty well. It does a great job against other X1s. It can trade for X2s while having all kinds of additional upside with equipment, tricks, and other buffs. So adding toxic 1 to the mix is pretty sweet, especially because it means this will give the opponent 2 poison if it does get in unblocked. And it is a real pain to block if your opponent is untapped when they're attacking with it, both because they could blow up your block or you could suddenly end up taking a ton of damage if they use a trick. This kind of creature is just a real problem. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it is Kemba Ka Enduring, which for 1 generic into white is a 2/2 legendary cat cleric at rare. When it or another cat enters the battlefield under your control, you attach up to 1 target equipment you control to that creature. Equipped creatures you control get +1/+1, and you can pay 3 generic and 2 white to make a 2/2 white cat creature token. There is a lot of good equipment in this set. The red-white deck is all about it, so Kemba is going to thrive. The free equip when it enters isn't always going to trigger, but when it does, it'll feel great, especially because Kemba will get an additional +1/+1. And if the ability to make equipment way better wasn't enough for you, in the late game, Kemba can generate tons of cat tokens. It's a little bit of a build around, maybe, but this can do things that all white decks in the format will be interested in, even if Kemba isn't doing all of those things in each of those decks. Like, you'll play this in a deck that has 0 other equipment in it because it's a 2-mana 2/2 that can crank out tokens late. So it just fits everywhere. Obviously, you're going to get the most value in a world where you have, 4 or 5 equipment that can really allow you to take full advantage. But I think this is a great card in every white deck. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Leonin the Lightbringer, which for 2 generic into white is a 3/2 cat rebel. At common, it's got Ward 2, and as long as it's equipped, it gets +1/+1. So we've seen equipping won't be that hard in the format, but the payoff here isn't amazing or anything. Ward 2 does make it a nice place to put equipment since it feels awful if your opponent kills something in response to you equipping it, and this makes that harder for your opponent. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Mandible Justicar, which for 1 generic into white is a 2/1 artifact creature Phyrexian cleric at common. It's got lifelink, and whenever another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. This is a pretty serious 2-drop. A 2-mana 2/1 with lifelink is usually already fairly playable, and this will often be a 3/2 or larger on your turn. Seems like a great 2-drop for aggressive decks that have lots of artifacts. Cards that make like multiple mites are going to be particularly nasty here. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Mirren Bardiche, which for 4 generic and a white is a common artifact equipment with 4 Mirrodin. The equipped creature gets +2/+1 and has vigilance, and it can equip for 3 generic and a white. This gives you a 5-mana 4/3 with vigilance up front, as is the case for most of the common for Mirrodin equipment. That rate wouldn't really be acceptable all on its own, but being able to move the boost around when you need to is pretty nice. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Mondrak Glory Dominus, which for 2 generic and 2 white is a 4/4 legendary creature Phyrexian horror at mythic rare. If 1 or more tokens would be created under your control, twice that many of those tokens are created instead, and you can pay 1 generic and 2 white/Phyrexian mana, which means you can pay 2 life or white mana, and sacrifice 2 other artifacts and or creatures to put an indestructible counter on Mondrak. If you're making tokens, this is going to make your day. Generating all those extra tokens is great, especially because, as a baseline, you've got a 4-mana 4/4 that can become indestructible. And the fact that Mondrak multiplies your tokens means it's going to be easier for you to get to the point where you can make it indestructible. Obviously, you do need tokens, but as we've seen, that's not a huge ask from white decks. This works well with Mirrodin. It works well with all the cards that make pest tokens. It doesn't really feel like it needs a build-around grade. I think it's just a bomb. I only think it gets into the lower bomb range, but you can play this with 1 mana up and keep it around forever thanks to indestructibility. It looks really good, giving it an A-. Next up, it is Norn's Wellspring, which for 1 generic and a white is a rare artifact. Whenever a creature you control dies, scry 1 and put an oil counter on Norn's Wellspring. You can pay 1 and tap it to remove 2 oil counters from it and draw a card. This can generate some pretty real value, especially because white is good at making all these tokens. The only awkward thing is actually making your pest tokens die is a bit of a challenge because they can't just trade, or rather, chump block. Scrying 1 when a creature dies isn't huge, but drawing a card for every second creature that dies makes a difference, and with Proliferate, you can sometimes get this going even more quickly. Your deck does need a lot of creatures to really take full advantage here, but I feel like this can have a big impact on the game sometimes. I'm giving it a C+. Next, it's Orthodoxy Enforcer, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/4 Phyrexian cleric. At common, it's got vigilance, and it gets +2/+0 as long as you control 2 or more artifacts. This is a solid common payoff for having artifacts in your deck, as a 4 mana 4/4 with vigilance is a pretty real body all game long. When you don't get it going though, this will feel pretty bad. A 4 mana 2/4 with vigilance is probably like a D. I think the overall grade here is a C. Next up, it's Ossification, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon enchantment aura. It says enchant basic land you control. When it enters the battlefield, exile target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls until Ossification leaves the battlefield. This is a neat take on this type of removal, one we haven't really seen since Chained to the Rocks. Basically, this is going to be a 2 mana removal spell, and that is premium. The only downside about this getting attached to a land is your opponent can rid themselves of it with land destruction or enchantment destruction, and that matters some, but I don't think it's a huge concern since land destruction is mostly awful and limited. It is nice this hits planeswalkers too. There are more of them than normal in this set because there's a bunch at rare in addition to the usual mythic ones. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it is Phyrexian Vindicator, which costs 4 white mana for a 5/5 Phyrexian horror at mythic rare. It's got flying. If damage would be dealt to Phyrexian Vindicator, prevent that damage. When damage is prevented this way, it deals that much damage to any other target. It's pretty cool that this is modeled after Phyrexian Obliterator like it's a white version. And this is a super powerful reason to consider going monocolored or close to it. It has amazing stats. It's very hard to deal with. It does just die to normal, like straight up removal, but the fact that damage gets blanked and punishes the opponent makes a huge difference. So it really narrows the number of removal spells that actually work on it. I think this is a bomb with the caveat that you do have to be pretty darn close to mono white to make it castable. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Planar Disruption, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon enchantment aura. It says enchant artifact, creature, or planeswalker. Enchanted permanent can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. This really leaves pacifism and arrest in the dust, and it's a great common removal spell for white. Regular pacifism effects often have the downside of not shutting down activated abilities, so you can't always completely remove a powerful card, but you can get closer to that with Planar Disruption. You do still have to worry about static effects, but those are much rarer. It's great that you can slap this on artifacts and planeswalkers too. This is premium removal. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Plated Onslaught, which for 3 generic and 2 white is an uncommon instant with affinity for artifacts, which means it costs 1 less for each artifact you control. Creatures you control get +2/+1 until end of turn. So this is a big payoff for going wide, especially with mites, because they're artifact tokens. All of your artifacts make this cheaper, and obviously if you have a bunch of mites, you're also going to want this sort of mass pump effect anyway. This sort of card usually needs a build-around grade because if you don't have enough ways to go really wide, it's not very good. But when you're in the right deck, this will end a lot of games. I'm going to say it's like a D+ in your typical white deck in the format, and a C+ in a deck that's really great at going wide, especially with artifact creatures. Next up, it's Porcelain Zealot, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/3 Phyrexian soldier at uncommon. It says at the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. If that creature has Toxic, instead it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. This does have some pretty awful base stats, but at least it can buff itself, so it can attack as a 3/4. And what really seems great here is the +2/+2 boost it can give to toxic creatures. That'll make whatever toxic creature you have in play a lot harder to block profitably, which of course also means your opponent's probably getting a poison counter, which can set up your corrupted or help you poison your opponent or whatever. There's a lot of toxic creatures to buff, as we've seen. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Resistance United, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon instant. It says target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Equipped creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. So this is like a D-level trick without the equipment upside. As I've already said in this video, 2 mana for +2/+2 isn't great. It can win you some combats, but it's not that efficient and doesn't have that much additional upside. and you need tricks to be flexible and powerful to counteract the riskiness of them. The equipment upside is nice, and once you can do that, you can turn this into something that can blank some removal, and it can even produce some blowouts if several of your equipped creatures are being blocked or something, but it is still pretty situational, and even in a set with lots of equipment, I think you're going to cut this from a lot of your white decks. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Sinew Dancer, which for 1 white mana is a 1/1 Phyrexian soldier at common. You can pay 3 generic and a white and tap it to tap target creature, and it has Corrupted. You can only activate this ability if an opponent has 3 or more poison counters. You can pay 1 and tap it to tap target creature. So, if you don't get Corrupted going, this card's pretty awful. While Master Decoy type creatures are nice, we've seen in the past that asking for this much mana for the tap effect is just too much, and not an effective way to use your mana on like 99% of your turns. Obviously, if you can get some poison on your opponent, it gets way better, as 1 mana a turn to tap something often just feels like removal. There is some interesting synergy to be had here, as if you have 3 poison on your opponent, you probably have some toxic creatures in play, in which case tapping down a blocker is going to be increasingly problematic for your opponent. That said, getting 3 poison on your opponent is significant enough setup, and the baseline here is pretty bad. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's Skrelv Defector Might, which for 1 white mana is a rare legendary artifact creature, Phyrexian Might. It's a 1/1 with Toxic 1. It can't block, and you can pay 1 white/Phyrexian mana and tap it and choose a color. Another target creature you control gains Toxic 1 and Hexproof from that color until end of turn. It can't be blocked by creatures of that color this turn. If you can play this early, he's going to get a few poison on your opponent, so your corrupted cards will get better, and if you get him late, he can function as a really obnoxious way to protect your other creatures from removal or make them unblockable. He's going to feel sort of like Mother of Runes, and that's a pretty good comparison. This gives him some serious relevance all game long, which is not something you can usually say about 1-drops. I'm giving him a B. Next up, it's Skrelv's Hive, which for 1 generic and a white is a rare enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life and create a Might token. It has Corrupted. As long as your opponent has 3 or more poison counters, creatures you control with Toxic have lifelink. Playing this on turn 2 seems pretty good, as you're likely to overwhelm your opponent with Mights, and once they've been hit a few times, the fact that all your toxic creatures gain lifelink is great, and really offsets the fact that these Mights can't block. The great thing is, even if you get this late, you can get some value by at least giving your board, or at least your toxic part of your board, lifelink, assuming your opponent has some poison by the later stage of the game. Still, it isn't nearly as good in the mid to late game as it is early, because your 1/1 tokens aren't as likely to be as much of a problem for your opponent. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Swooping Lookout, which for 1 white mana is a 1/2 artifact creature Phyrexian construct at uncommon. It's got Flying and Vigilance. A 1 mana 1/2 with Flying and Vigilance is an okay card in most formats. It is a kind of card people can overrate, because a 1/2 flyer is pretty irrelevant in most games by the middle or late game when there's just better flyers around. But in a format with a lot of incentives to play artifacts and a lot of reasons to play equipment, which this carries well, this gets significantly more interesting. There will definitely be games when this comes down on turn 1 and does some damage and then gets suited up and just runs away with the game. It probably isn't great, but I don't imagine I'll ever cut the first of these from white decks that are interested in being aggressive. Whether you're interested in artifacts or you're interested in equipment, it's going to work out pretty well. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Vanish into Eternity, which for 2 generic and a white is a common instant. It costs 3 more to cast if it targets a creature. Exile target non-land permanent. This has a pretty cool design. 6 mana to exile a creature is pretty far from an ideal rate, even on an instant. It just isn't easy for a spell that expensive to ever be premium, because you're usually going to overpay to kill something cheaper. But the fact that this can deal with other permanent types much more efficiently helps things even out. Basically, this is going to be a more expensive disenchant early, and then late it can deal with anything. It definitely isn't premium, even with that modality, but I think the first copy will make the cut in a lot of white decks because it's nice and flexible. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Veil of Assimilation, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon artifact. When it or another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, target creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains Vigilance until end of turn. I think this seems pretty good. +1/+1 in Vigilance is often a meaningful buff, and getting it over and over is pretty nice. It's nice that the turn you play this, it'll give you that buff right away, and then it's nice that, you'll continually be able to play artifacts and get buffs. We've seen that a lot of creatures in white happen to be artifacts, and we've seen a lot of Might tokens, so I think there's enough synergy just within white for this card to do some pretty serious work. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's White Sun's Twilight, which for X and 2 white mana is a rare sorcery. It says you gain X life, create X 1/1 Might tokens, and if X is 5 or more, destroy all other creatures. So, if you don't cast this with X as 5 or more, it's not that impressive. The new creatures you make, of course, can't block, so as far as your opponent is concerned on their turn, it's sort of like you didn't impact the board. You know, they do have to worry about a bunch of tokens that have Toxic to some extent, so it will make them play a little bit differently, and you gain some life, which makes it more likely that you're going to be able to survive. But there are going to be times where casting this without paying 5 or more for X is just going to feel awful. However, if you can pay a full 7 for this, 5 for X, it becomes insane, thanks to the fact that you will always come out ahead after the dust clears. If it was only a 7 mana card with that effect, it would be pretty good. Expensive, but utterly game-breaking, so at least it has this additional early game upside where sometimes you just need to add a bunch of artifacts to the board, maybe to trigger things like the Veil we just saw and stuff like that. Overall, this looks really powerful. I'm giving it an A-. Next, it's our last card, Zealot's Conviction, which for 1 white mana is a common enchantment aura with flash and enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1, and it has Corrupted if your opponent has those 3 or more poison counters. This gives an additional +1/+0 and first strike. This seems really sweet for aggro decks. A 1 mana aura with flash that gives +1/+1 is already kind of acceptable. The boost isn't massive, so it can't win that many combats for you, but the fact that it leaves a permanent buff behind really matters, because it means you affect the board in the short term and long term when you can win combat with it. Plus, we've seen that really cheap 1 mana tricks have all really overperformed lately. They just give you a lot for the small amount of mana you spend. And that's especially true here when you get Corrupted going. This becomes really good if you can do that, because +2/+1 and first strike for 1 mana is likely to win you most combats, and then that whole buff stays around. It isn't like some of these we've seen lately where the first strike only lasts until end of turn. That part of the buff will stay around permanently. It probably sounds like I'm going to give this a super high grade or something, but it does still have the downside most auras and tricks have. They're situational and are disastrous when things go wrong, so it's probably just a C, but I can see this being a key card in white aggro decks. So those are all the white cards in Phyrexia All Will Be One. Tomorrow I'll be back with all my thoughts on the blue cards. If you enjoyed this video and it helped you out, consider liking it and sharing it so it can help others. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you're looking for the rest of this set review, the playlist should be on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and my work on the channel, you can do that by becoming a patron, by buying Need to Hone merch, or becoming a channel member. You can find ways to do all of those things in the description. Thanks for watching.